Alright guys, welcome back. Today I have another Forge World painting video for you. This time it's the Custodes Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. But I'm not going to be painting it up in the boring gold armour. Instead I'm going to be using the Mr. Weathering pigment, which I've been trying to perfect the technique in using over the past couple of months. And I'm going to paint this up in a custom Shadowkeepers style. So when it comes to the assembly and cleanup of the model, this one was actually 3D printed, which meant there was actually very minimal cleanup. There was only a few support marks that needed to be sanded down, and I can guarantee you it would have been a hell of a lot easier than if I had bought this direct from Forge World. But once it was ready, I decided to keep it partially assembled, just to make it a little bit easier to paint up the beginning stages. So starting from a black primer, we're going to start to build up a desaturated blue-grey zenithal highlight on the model. And this is a three-part process where we gradually build up the highlights on the model using a blue-grey colour rather than a grey and white zenithal. And to start the process, we're going to airbrush the entire model with Citadel Skavenblight Dinge. Any really dark grey would work for this part, and all you really want to do here is blast the entire model, making sure you cover about 95% of the model, just leaving those deepest recesses left in the black undercoat. Next we're going to be applying Army Painter Fanatics Night Sky, and I'm just going to airbrush this on from above the model and at 45 degrees as well, which will colour all the top facing surfaces and leave all the bottom facing surfaces in the previous grey colour. And for the final armour highlight, I'm going to be using Army Painter Runic Cobalt, which is a slightly lighter blue-grey in the Army Painter triad. And for this highlight, we only want to spray it on from the top of the model, making sure that we hit all of the highest points on each section of the model. Next, I'm going to be tackling the large shoulder pads, and for that I'm going to be using Magecast Magenta and Spellbound Fuchsia from the Army Painter Fanatics Magenta Triad. Starting off with Magecast Magenta, and I'm just going to airbrush this on to 95% of the shoulder pad, just leaving the very bottom part still in black. And then moving on to the Spellbound Fuchsia, and then just applying this to the top half of the shoulder pad, leaving plenty of the previous colour still visible left behind. Next, it's time to go back to the main body of the model and paint in all of the gold trim. And to do that, I'm going to be using Army Painter Greedy Gold. There are quite a few emblems and trims that need to be painted up here in the gold, so just take your time and try and not to get any of the gold onto the nicely highlighted armour. However, if you do have a misplaced brush stroke, your best bet is to quickly go in with a damp brush and try and mop it away before it dries. Otherwise, you're going to have to colour match along with the highlights. I then went in with a brush and painted in all of the missiles mounted on top of the model with exactly the same magenta colours I used for the shoulder pads. And the final step before we move on to using the weathering pigment is to use Frost Blue to spot highlight all of the rivets on the armour plates. And this blue is the lightest colour in the desaturated blue-grey Army Painter triad. And after that I applied a coat of gloss varnish to the entire model, which is a really important part for the next step, which is I'm going to be applying the Mr. Weathering multi-black pigment. And this both helps to protect the model from any damage and also is going to improve the flow properties of the pigment. Now, I get a lot of questions regarding this Mr. Weathering pigment in terms of whether people should get it or not and if there are any alternatives. As I know, it can be quite hard to get a hold of depending on where you're from. So the first thing I would say is I do highly recommend it, as it is really easy to use and produces great results, as you'll see at the end of this video. So if you can get a hold of it easily, I do recommend that you do give it a try. I don't think you'll be disappointed. However, if it's not something you can get a hold of easily, then the only other alternative you have is to go down the black oil paint route, which is something I've used very briefly a few times in the past. And this product, Mr. Weathering Pigment, from what I can tell, is just a pre-thinned down oil wash. So if that's the case, then you should be able to use any black oil wash to achieve the same results. However, it will involve messing about with thinners and trying to get the correct consistency, whereas the Mr. Weathering is usable straight out of the bottle. So you should be able to use something like one of these Winsor & Newton black oil paints. From what I remember, you use white spirit to thin this down, as it's extremely thick out of the tube and you'll need quite a bit of thinner, but I'm sure with a bit of playing about it wouldn't be too difficult to come up with the right consistency. I did try and have a look at the bottle of the Mr. Weathering pigment to see if I could gather any information about what it was. However, everything's in Japanese, so unfortunately I have no idea. But if I was to place a bet on it, I would say that it's just overpriced, pre-thinned down oil paint. And the first step is to apply the weathering pigment to the model. And I like to prepare the pigment and the solvent in separate pots, or in this case bottle caps, just so I've got plenty of pigment and solvent at the ready when I need it. And as I mentioned before, the pigment itself doesn't need thinned and can be used straight up out of the bottle. You just need to make sure you give the bottle a good shake before you use it. And you just want to slap this on the entire model, making sure that you cover all areas. Then you just need to clean off all the excess pigment from your brush, grab a paper towel, and to use the solvent to push the excess pigment into all the recesses, and also to wick up all of the pooling that will be occurring in the model. The main idea here is that you want to use the solvent to remove all of the excess pigment from all of the highlight areas on the model, specifically all of the areas that we highlighted up in the previous airbrushing steps. And the only things you really need to worry about here is making sure you keep wicking your brush off on a paper towel, as it will get overly saturated with pigment very quickly. And you'll also notice that the pigment is pooling at the same spots across the model, so just make sure you revisit these spots every so often, as the pigment will continue to gather there. And once that's fully dried, you should have a really nicely shaded model, which will be overly shined due to all of the varnish and weathering pigment that's been applied. So it'll just need a good coat of matte varnish to take away all of that nasty shine, and then the model will be ready to be based. And when it comes to the base, I decided to 3D print a Custodes style resin base, with the idea that I was going to try and create a marbling effect on the surface of the base, using a technique I saw on YouTube earlier on that day. And that involved priming the base in black, and then using a dried out wet white, which has been stretched out by hand, which creates a kind of spider web effect, and then stretching that across the entire base. And then I just came in with a white rattle can and sprayed a nice even coat over the top of the base. And then I just peeled the wet wipe away, and for my first attempt I was fairly happy with it. There were a few areas that were overly black as I didn't stretch the wet wipe enough, so I just went back in again over that black section and did it again, and I was much happier with the result. And the last thing I did was paint in all of the little diamonds on the marble flooring, and I just used the same magenta triad as I did in the rest of the magenta parts on the model. All in all, I was delighted in the way the model turned out, and there was nothing too complex involved. It was really just a case of a zenithal highlight followed by blocking in all of the colours and then applying the weathering pigment or oil wash, and it creates a really amazingly shaded black armour with minimal effort. Anyway, as always, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. And if you did, don't forget to throw me a like. And if you want to see more Custodes painted up in this method, then just drop a comment down below letting me know what you'd like to see next. But until then, happy painting, and I'll see you in the next one.